Hello and welcome to another episode of CPCine, the Amstrad CPC magazine show where each episode covers a month in the life of this phenomenal family of 8-bit computers. This time it's August 1985 and the Amstrad official magazine CPC 464 user has just launched. We take a look at two early 464 games, the DDI-1 Interface and FD-1 disk drive get a once over, and we come right up to the modern era with a look at Pentomino. There's a lot to cover in the news roundup for August 1984, not least being the launch of the CPC's first magazine. CPC 464 User began life as a bi-monthly newsletter for people who subscribed by joining the Amstrad User Club. It wouldn't be until early 1985 that the magazine became something you could pick up on the high street, although we will cover more on that when we get to it. In the meantime, let's take a look at the news. In a month where the dragon has been slain, the Auric is teetering on the verge of collapse, MSX shipments look to be delayed until after the all-important Christmas period, and Imagine Software has entered receivership, the main bulk of the Amstrad news this month is the same as for the previous month. The CPC has recently launched and software is trickling out for it, both serious applications and games. As a result of the launch of Amstrad's own CPC magazine and the smattering of coverage in Popular Computing Weekly, which this month admits it would like more CPC coverage but is apparently reliant on readers actually sending something in for them to print, we are now able to get a better idea of the lineup of software and games available for the Amstrad at the 3-month mark since its release. Here's what we know is available so far. On the gaming front, 464 users can enjoy Hunting for Lost Jewels in Sultan's Maze, which we reviewed in episode 1, surprisingly in-depth space combat in Codename Matt, avoiding guardians and copyright lawyers in blatant Pac-Man clone Haunted Hedges, frenzied bouncing around a cavern while panicking because you can't avoid a flying monster in Roland in the Caves, pinching treasures from an ancient tomb while ghosts and other nasties try to kill you in Roland on the Ropes, bell-ringing platform goodness in a brilliant conversion of the original Hunchback, shooting down enemy aircraft, blowing up enemy ships, don't destroy your own ship, you'll need it, and potentially committing a war crime by bombing the hell out of a city in Harrier Attack. Avoiding Sir Clive Sinclair while you nick all his stuff from his own warehouses in Electro Freddy. More tomb plundering action in Oh Mummy. What's with the tomb delving in early Amstrad games? Defending the Earth from the invading Zargon fleet in Alien Break-In. Repairing a failing nuclear power plant in Spannerman, a game that looked so much like Roland Goes Digging that at first I thought I'd loaded the wrong game. Ridding the space lanes of pirates and raiders in the excellent Star Commando. Flying and landing a Boeing 737 in Flight Path 737, which we'll be taking a more in-depth look at in episode 4. Enduring annoying controls and lackluster gameplay in House of Usher. Finding the keys and defusing the bombs in 3D Monster Chase. Shooting protons with a super laser, it's more fun than it sounds, in Atom Smasher. Trying to understand how they managed to screw up a golf game so badly in Ams Golf. And attempting to non-violently resist an oppressive dictatorial regime in Holdfast. We also have our first potentially lost games. Pengo Clone Penguin may have been released, it was certainly mentioned in Popular Computing at the time, but I can't find any copies online. Similarly, Burger Time clone Mr. Wimpy was announced for the CPC, but no copies exist online, although there is a very nice French port of Burger Time available. Then there's the intriguingly named Space Pirate, which I have to assume is an arcade game of some sort. Again, it was mentioned as an early title in Popular Computing Weekly's new releases for that week, but that's all I can find out about it. It doesn't appear on any Internet Archives or review lists, so the title is all I can find out about it. Is this a misidentified game? Is this actually Star Commando or something similar? I have no idea. Finally, we have Microbot, a game I can find absolutely no information about. It's not mentioned anywhere outside a line in Popular Computing Weekly saying it was released, so whether it was a small homebrew game that didn't get widespread attention, or whether it was slated for release but never actually got published, I don't know. Did any of these games actually come out? Were they released under a different name? If you know, leave a message in the comments. Meanwhile, in Serious Software, we have an equally impressive and varied assortment of offerings. New Amstrad users can enjoy learning to program their new computer using Introduction to Basic, which, at $19.99, is apparently the only launch title that wasn't priced at the standard £9.99. writing letters very slowly in Easy Amsword, which we reviewed in episode 1, and waiting a very long time to get hold of its big brother, Amsword, also known as Amsword 2 in some areas, or even as Advanced Amsword. Because of production delays due to extensive testing, Amsword would not arrive until December 1984, so maybe we'll talk about that one in a later episode. Continuing with the series software, new Amstrad users could also try their hand at coding at a more advanced level with Highsoft's first Pascal package, Pascal 4T, and coding at the fastest and most in-depth level with DevPack, Highsoft's famous Z80 assembler, which we'll be taking a thorough look at in episode 3. That's a lot of software to keep even the more shopaholic Amstrad users happy for a good long while, and as we all know, the early glut of titles wouldn't slow down anytime soon. There was always more on the way for Amstrad fans in the 80s. And fans there were aplenty, because Amstrad was making some inroads into the educational market back in August 1984. A few schools had decided to forego the usual BBC systems for their IT use, and had instead chosen to go with the CPC 464 as their classroom micro. That's some pretty impressive marketing at Amstrad at work right there, because the BBC was being pushed heavily in the education market. Sadly, we all know how this ends since the BBC dominated in schools, but hey, it's pretty good going nevertheless, and a bit of competition in the market never hurt. Speaking of education, there were several educational titles released for the CPC by August 1984, mostly coming from Bourne Software. These include a lovely little hangman game in the form of Word Hang, a demo of which was included on the 464's welcome tape as we discussed in episode 1. There was also Happy Letters, Happy Numbers, Happy Writing, the 2 Time Man games, Map Rally, Worldwise, and, of course, the ridiculous guessing game Animal Vegetable Mineral. Does that really count as an educational title? Well, it's hardly a game, so maybe? I'll let you decide that one. Either way, that's not a bad lineup for parents looking for educational software, especially when it's still so early in the CPC's life. Meanwhile, extra hardware is either being released for the system or announced as coming soon. This includes the DDI-1 Interface and its accompanying FD-1 external disk drive unit, which is set to arrive in November, although the official magazine is predicting readers won't actually see this one until December, and Popular Computing Weekly was talking about CPC bundles including Hitachi 3-inch drives in the same week that the CPC 464 launched. We'll have an in-depth look at the DDI-1 later in this episode, but it's worth noting that Amstrad has not been quiet about the existence of these drives. They have in fact been using prototype drives at several computer shows, which is presumably how Popular Computing Weekly knew about them, to quickly load software and demonstrate the power of the CPC 464. No wonder the press kept talking about their desire for a disk interface. They've already seen how good one can be on the Amstrad. Other news this month includes Amsoft having problems with their order processing system, which apparently ran on an ICL Mini. So there's no CPCs at Amsoft HQ? For shame! But the official magazine was assured that the backlog would soon be sorted out. We also got a quick reference to the famous unreliability of Amstrad's JY1 joysticks, with one breaking due to a frustrated player of codename Matt at one computer show. If it had been a frustrated player of Daley Thompson's Decathlon, I think we could all understand. Rest in peace all those JY1s that fell in the line of service due to that game. Since it launched this month, I thought it would be nice to take a quick look at Amstrad's official CPC magazine. We'll do a more in-depth retrospective in a later episode, but for now, I want to give the new magazine a quick once-over. CPC 464 user would soon become Amstrad CPC 464 user when it began high street distribution at issue 3, and it then changed its name once again to simply Amstrad Computer User in issue 6 after the launch of the CPC 664. That must have been a confusing time for readers, not knowing what their magazine was actually going to be called when they went to look for it on the shelf each month. But whatever the name, the magazine itself had some pretty good content. It spends a lot of time on the technical side of things, which no doubt put off a lot of kids. I know I used to find it quite a boring read when I was younger, compared to the wacky antics of Amstrad action, but when I've come back to it as a more mature reader, I have to admit it's got a lot going for it. The technical articles range from basic introductions for people who've never owned a computer before, to more in-depth discussions of the CPC's finer technical points and abilities. The early issues are especially interesting because of the decision to not just cover the usual amateur and techie stuff that other magazines would periodically run, but also to branch out. There are, of course, articles on programming in BASIC and machine code, both staples of the 8-bit magazines, but also courses on Forth, a discussion on how printers work, with diagrams demonstrating the way that they actually put the ink onto the paper, in case you're interested in the more physical side of things, and regular pieces on CPM. All of this, of course, fits with Amstrad's business model of marketing the CPC as a serious computer for home and business alike, not just as a games machine, but it still makes for interesting reading. It may be the official publication, and therefore far less likely to criticise the Amstrad system than other magazines would, but it's still a very good read, and the full set of issues is available from the Internet Archive, link in the description. As I said, this is just a quick overview and we'll be going into far more depth in a later episode, but I thought it was a good idea to take a quick look over the magazine, to highlight its best point, the technical articles, in comparison with a far more light-hearted, although admittedly also in-depth when it needed to be, and far more popular rival publication that was looming just around the corner. For now, however, I'll leave you with this piece that I promised last episode. Locomotive Software's Chris Hall said in an interview with Popular Computing Weekly in May 1984, "We wanted to avoid magic numbers in the BASIC," referring to the C64's need to poke at various memory addresses to get anything done. "The firmware was made as a series of routines," he said, and it's true, pretty much everything the CPC can do can be accessed using commands that go straight to those routines. Some of the commands can be a little long-winded when you want to do something specific, and it can get annoying when you want to do those things a lot, hence the ability to program the CPC's function keys so you can run those commands at the push of a button. One of the beauties of Locomotive BASIC is the ability to access a lot of the CPC's raw power right from the ready prompt, including customizing the machine. I used to run a short program off my main disk, which I called my startup disk, which would set up the computer just as I liked it for working on, including reprogramming all of the function keys. This startup file was barely more than 2K in length, because the CPC's BASIC made setting up the system just how I liked it so very simple. So how do you reprogram the function keys to do what you want? It's simple. You use the key command. The code for this is key, number, comma, set of commands. If you want that command to be run immediately rather than simply writing it to the screen, you have to add plus CHR $ open bracket 13 close bracket to the end of the line. CHR $13 is the character string code for the return key, so you're essentially telling the CPC to press enter when it's finished typing in your desired code. Any command strings of text that you enter will need to be placed inside quotation marks, as the key command is pushing a string of text out to the command line, not executing that code itself. This means that you aren't limited to basic commands on the function keys. You can enter whatever you would like. Is there a line of text that you keep having to input? Assign it to a function key and save yourself some typing. Programmable function keys is just one of the lovely little ways that showed there was a lot more good design and careful thought put into the Amstrad CPC than it generally gets credit for. I have to admit that when researching the early titles for the CPC, I was intrigued by the Introduction to BASIC that is mentioned in Popular Computing Weekly as the only launch title that wasn't priced at £7.99. I had never heard of this title, and it seems that a lot of other people hadn't either, because it's not listed on the CPC Wiki or any other CPC related website, as far as I could see anyway. So what is Introduction to BASIC? Well, as far as I can tell, it's not exactly a software package in the usual sense of the word. It's this thing instead. Teach Yourself Amstrad BASIC, a tutorial guide, part 1. Or at least, that's all I could find that they could possibly have been talking about. They may have combined Introduction to BASIC with Part 2, Further BASIC. Well, that's what the 1984 Amsoft catalogue called it. Part 1 of this guide calls it More Basic. It's no wonder people can't find these things when they're searching online. As you can see, it's a big, ring-bound manual in one of Amsoft's lovely cardboard slipcases. It should come bundled with 2 cassettes containing all of the programs that you have to type in, but my copy sadly has the first cassette missing in action. The book lays out flat on a table thanks to being held in a ring binder, which is incredibly useful when working from it because you can keep both hands free for typing. It introduced a number of concepts from basic programming and includes several small games to demonstrate those concepts. There are 12 chapters in total, with the book recommending that you spend an evening or two on each chapter before moving on. I can guarantee that anyone with even the most basic of knowledge of the CPC will not need to spend an evening on each chapter. The first 4 chapters are about setting up the computer, including loading some software and playing a couple of games. Simon, that traditional go-to memory game that pretty much everyone who wants to learn to code will be able to make a variant on. and Hangman, which we already played a version of on the welcome tape that came with the computer. So far, so pointless, as far as teaching you anything about coding in BASIC. So that's a quarter of the book being a complete waste of time because the manual does this all already. So is there anything worthwhile in this thing? Let's jump to Chapter 5 and actually start getting into basic programming, because Chapter 4 only discusses the basic of drawing in BASIC very briefly. Chapter 5 covers the plot, draw and move commands along with the standard basic commands that everyone needs to know. List, new, CLG, which is a variant on the standard CLS command that clears the screen but doesn't empty the memory and also places the graphics cursor at coordinates 0, 0. Very useful to know about if you're intending to draw anything using BASIC. It's at this point that the book starts to become useful. It doesn't spend too much time on each command, but it does give you enough information about what each command does and how you can use it, beginning with drawing a dot on the screen and then building on that to produce a line, a square, and then, finally, a house. This is a good example of how the book begins with a fairly simple concept and then builds on it until you have something that's a lot more complex. It's good stuff and written fairly well too. Chapter 6 covers the print, let, a command I personally never found worth using because you can cut it out and save memory in pretty much every single circumstance, save, locate, and input commands. Again, the book starts with a simple concept and builds it into something way more complex that takes the original idea and shows you how it can be applied in a useful way. Each chapter gets more and more complex, as you would expect as you work your way through the course, but even by the time you're up to Chapter 9 and is discussing program design, it's still not something that the average user who has bothered to read the CPC's manual would find it all that complicated, or all that new if truth be told. The manual is comprehensive and includes several chapters on basic programming. This book is certainly laid out neater and more straightforward than the manual was, but it's not covering all that many new or different topics. If you're familiar with basic programming, there's not a lot this book can offer you, so you may be better off taking a look at the second volume instead. But for beginners, or for people who didn't like the way the manual handled this stuff, it's a very handy introduction to the CPC's BASIC. I know I found it useful back at the time, but that's probably because I was one of those kids who didn't get along too well with how the manual laid out its basic tutorial until I was much older. I spent many nights after school working through this book with my mother when I was 5. Although thinking back, I'm not entirely sure that she got as much out of it as I did, but hey, thanks for tolerating my nerdy instincts, Mum. It's interesting to note that this book wasn't always well received. In issue 3 of CPC 464 User, one reader commented that the 464's manual covers everything. I could have saved myself £17. And to be fair, he's not wrong. The manual covers everything an Introduction to Basic could possibly cover, because the manual includes an Introduction to Basic. So the audience for this additional book is going to be limited. Perhaps we'll have something deeper and more involved to get our teeth into when we take a look at Volume 2 in a later episode. We'll have to wait and see. So if you're interested in taking a look at this guide, both Part 1 and Part 2 are available as PDFs from the CPC Wiki, and I've included links in the description box. Before we delve into this week's game review, I want to take a moment to address a major problem with the Amstrad's official magazine, and that is the fact that it reviews Amsoft products far too leniently. Now okay, every official magazine is guilty of this. They have to keep the owners happy, and sadly that comes at the expense of objectivity, but in this issue their lack of ability to review properly couldn't be more apparent. Roland on the Run cannot be described as following the high standard of previous Roland games. Roland on the Run cannot be summarised as providing many hours of amusement. Roland on the Run is the worst game in the entire Roland canon. It barely counts as a game. It's a tech demo for a computerised torture device. It's appalling. Amstrad Computer User gave it a good review. We will not be following ACU's review scores very closely on CPCine, and if you need to ask why, just rewind this video a few seconds and listen again. Okay, let's get on with our own and most definitely independent reviews. As launch titles go, could you get a brighter, more fun and easy to play game than Oh Mummy? I'm hard pressed to think of one. Okay, sure, it's not a game that has immense staying power, you can literally see everything it has to offer in under 5 minutes, and okay, the game is ridiculously easy once you get to grips with the controls, but aside from that, it's a lot of fun and it shows off the CPC's range pretty well. The sound is decent if repetitive, the colours are bold and lovely to look at. The game itself is simple yet fun, which is exactly what you want when showing off a new system and trying to entice people into giving it a try. If anything, the game is let down by its controls. I was playing this on keyboard and joystick, and with both there were issues. You can only turn left and right if you're already moving, which makes timing your turns a little bit tricky. Most of the lives I lost while playing this were due to mistiming my turns. It's frustrating, yes, but it's not the end of the world. Nevertheless, it is an issue. The other problem is the shortness of the game. You get 5 levels to play on, and each level is the same layout, only the number of mummies and the location of the treasures changes. The mummies move randomly, so there's little in the way of challenge outside of their numbers, but even then, it gets to be a bit of a challenge when there are a lot of them about. However, once you've passed all 5 levels, and there are only 5 levels, you go right back to level 1 and suddenly there's no challenge anymore. As a launch title, I really enjoyed playing it. I enjoyed it as much now as I did back when I first got my CPC in 1985. It doesn't have a lot of staying power, but what it lacks in longevity, it more than makes up for in playability. Moving over to Electro Freddy, another launch title, and we now have a game that deals with all the level design and control issues of old Mummy. This game is silky smooth in its character movement, perhaps a little too smooth at times, as I found it was very easy to overrun my targets, which became a big problem in some of the later levels. The sprites here are large and colourful as a CPC should be, but there are some significant colour clashes going on when Freddy or our antagonist, who is totally not Sir Clive Sinclair honest, move through objects. This belies the game's nature as a port from another system, an issue that will sadly plague the CPC throughout its commercial life. There's no music this time, and what sound effects there are basic at best. A few bleeps and chirps are all you're going to get here. It's sad because the CPC is capable of so much more than that, but in all fairness, it won't distract from the game. Electro Freddy is a classic from the early life of the CPC, and while there are only a handful of levels that repeat and repeat as you progress, there's still a lot of fun to be had here. If there is anything that I would take away from this game though, it's this. Why is not Sir Clive selling plug sockets and radios when he clearly has advanced technology at his fingertips? The guy can fire spectrums from his eyes, and he employs force fields in his warehouses. What does he need with a room of wind-up clocks? Some things we will never know. Printed in the smallest font it was possible to print in back in 1984, this first issue of Amstrad's official magazine contains a surprise listing. It's just over 120 lines long, so let's take a look at what Amstrad put its seal of approval to at the dawn of the CPC era. Oh, for goodness sake! As listings go, this is an interesting one, despite its subject matter, and it shows us a lot about what is to come over the years as type-ins become more complex. Here we have line after line of data commands, any of which can screw up the entire program if you mistype one digit of the code. The function of each line is masked somewhat because of the reams of data that are contained in the program too, which becomes more and more common as type-in writers began introducing machine code into their basic routines just to squeeze that little more processing power out of the old CPC. Imagine how it must have felt to have sat there back in 1984, typing in line after line of this program from a tiny, hard-to-read page that's somewhere around A5 in size. You've squinted. You've nearly gone blind from the eye strain. You've listed the code and checked it. You've debugged every line of data that you've typed in incorrectly, because goodness knows there were a few, and then you've finally got to type run. That's what you were presented with. A 3-frame animation of low-grade porn in an official Amstrad publication. My goodness. I wonder how many kids didn't understand what they were supposed to get out of that. I also wonder how many immediately pressed escape twice to stop the program and hurriedly saved the listing to cassette so that they wouldn't have to type it in again. Still, if anyone complained about the listing, the letters certainly weren't published. The next 2 issues letters pages definitely had their fair share of grumbles in them, but none talk about the porn program. So maybe it's just 30 years of social change at work here. Who knows? Let's put computer-simulated smut aside for now and take a look at something that will be more to the liking of pretty much everyone who owned a CPC back at the start of its life. A simple breakout clone. This is Bust Out, the other type-in program from issue 1 of ACU. It's a very short program which demonstrates just how powerful the CPC's inbuilt BASIC can be when used properly. So how does it play? Well, it's a pretty basic breakout game, although to be fair, that's all it was ever going to be. It would be simple enough to add some extra features, tweak the sound or the colours, etc. if that's the kind of thing that you fancy doing, but as it stands, it passed 10 minutes well enough. The controls are pretty responsive, and once you get into it, it's reasonably easy to control the direction of the ball, well, square. All in all, not a bad little type-in for 42 lines of code, and certainly more worth your time than the Palm program. Disk drives have been in the pipeline since the introduction of the Amstrad CPC 464 at trade shows back in April '84. Amstrad had been using a prototype disk system to quickly load software for the 464 at various trade shows, and as a result the computing press had become very excited at the possibility of a disk-powered CPC. So although the actual release of the CPC's disk add-on is still a couple of months away when we're looking at August 1984, the magazines and the trade press are already talking about the DDI-1 and its accompanying FD-1. So I thought it would be the right time to introduce the disk system to you here on the show. Retailing initially for £199.95 for the interface and disk drive bundle, or £159 for just the drive, adding a disk to your CPC 464 was expensive. At its time of release, the DDI-1 and FD-1 package, and you need both if you want to use your new disk drive, was only £50 less than a CPC 464 with a green screen monitor. You could get the drive and interface package for £30 less if you were a subscriber to the Amstrad User Club, but membership would set you back £20. Membership did come with a subscription to CPC 464 User Magazine, however, so maybe some people thought of it as a bargain. I don't know. I probably would have, to be honest. So, what did your £200 purchase get you anyway? Was it worth it? Let's find out. First of all, let's take a look at the manual. As with all the Amstrad manuals from this era, the DDI-1 manual is comprehensive, containing a foundation course on the new AMS-DOS and extended basic commands that the interface adds to the CPC, plus a guide to making system disks, a brief guide to using CP/M, and even basic listings to save and load screenshots. There's even an introduction to the educational programming language Dr. Logo, although we will be covering that properly in a later episode. All in all, the manual is some pretty impressive stuff, written in Amstrad's usual technical but not too technical style. So what does the DDI-1 and FD-1 do for your CPC? Let's take a look. We'll start with the DDI-1 interface itself. This is the portion of the disk system package that plugs directly onto the CPC 464. It's a sturdy block of plastic with a connector ribbon fastened directly onto the side, which means you're going to have to be very careful with it, because if you break that ribbon, it's going to be a right pain in the backside to replace it. The DDI-1, which in the standard Amstrad naming system stands for Disk Drive Interface Model 1, Amstrad love their initials, don't they? Contains the ROM extensions for the CPC, adding AMS-DOS, expanding the BASIC with new disk commands, but not altering it to BASIC 1.1, which would have been an interesting and very welcome addition if they had, but maybe that was too far down the line for it to have been possible just yet, and basically making the base CPC system able to operate a disk drive. It's sturdy, it looks just fine when attached to the CPC, although we wouldn't have minded a label plate on the top of the interface, as it just looks like a blank block when it's attached to the system. And it even has a nice set of moulded guide rails on it, which not only stop you attempting to plug it in upside down, but which also hold the interface snugly onto the back of the CPC. All in all, it's a very nice add-on. The other part of the package is the FD-1 disk drive, which, again in standard Amstrad naming style, stands for Floppy Drive Model 1, as far as I can tell anyway. There was no Model 2 floppy drive, but perhaps Amstrad had their eye on it as a possible future add-on should it ever become needed, who knows. Since it never happened, we can but speculate. The disk drive itself is a chunky beast that requires its own power, supplied via a standard 3-pin plug here in the UK. The power supply doesn't just power the floppy drive, it also powers the DDI-1 interface via the ribbon cable connecting the drive to the interface. This is one of the two ways in which Amstrad purposefully made their disk interface incompatible with every other disk drive system on the planet. The second way they introduced an incompatibility, which was supposed to ensure that you only bought Amstrad drives instead of their competitors, was to mess around with the pin connections. There's a very good guide to sorting this problem out on the CPC wiki if you ever want to add a 3.5-inch drive or any other kind of device. The link for that is in the description box. Since the FD-1 drive requires a different plug, some users found that it is possible to wire the drive's power cable up to the same plug as the monitor, so that you don't need to use two power sockets, but I wouldn't recommend it. When I bought my current CPC 464 and accompanying DDI-1 together in the early 90s, this 2-in-1 power setup was how it arrived, because they were both second-hand devices, and I have to admit, I used the system just fine that way for several years, but I wouldn't recommend doing it now. Run it with its own power supply and save yourself any worries about power spiking and the like. The FD-1 disk drive is built to recognise being plugged in as either drive A or drive B, which allows you to simply plug a second FD-1 into the expansion slot found on the connector ribbon attached to the DDI-1 without having to mess around with the jumper settings. It's part of Amstrad's design methodology of making everything as simple for the average user to set up as possible. If you do connect in a second drive, it's designed to sit underneath the original drive, so bear that in mind. The supplied ribbon on the DDI-1 isn't long enough or flexible enough to twist it around so that a second drive can either sit above or alongside the first one. So if your workspace doesn't allow for two drives to stack vertically, you may want to invest in an extension cable. While we're on the subject of setting up your drives, the DDI-1 manual explicitly states that the drives should be set up to the right of the CPC 464, possibly with the MP1 modulator in between the 464 and the disk drive. Why does it need to be set up on the right hand side? Well, that's because the DDI-1 ribbon emerges from the right hand side of the interface and the cable is not long enough to keep the drive outside of the range of the monitor's magnetic field if you try to wrap the ribbon around the interface to reach the drive on the other side of the machine. Yeah, that's right, the CPC's monitor has a significant magnetic field emanating from it. It's not Coleco atom levels of electromagnetism, it doesn't emit an electromagnetic pulse that wipes cassettes whenever you turn the machine on or anything, but it is significant enough that, over time, it can wipe disks. That's why you should never store your disk on top of the monitor, like so many developers seem to do for magazine photo shoots back in the day, for reasons best known to them, and also why Amstrad recommends setting the disk drive up 20 centimeters away from the monitor. Luckily, that's just enough distance for the ribbon cable to reach without going taut. Okay, now the safety precautions are out of the way, let's take a look at the drive itself. It's a sturdy beast with a decent amount of ventilation on it to keep itself cool. It looks lovely, it fits in perfectly with the design aesthetic of the 464, and there are only 4 things to take note of on it. The power switch on the back, always be sure to turn the disk drive on before turning the CPC on, otherwise it won't work, and turn the drive off after the CPC is turned off too. The power light on the front being green. The chunky eject button on the front, which feels firm and well built, always a good sign for something that will get a lot of use, and the drive read-write light on the front, which is red like the 464's power light. Discs slide in with a nice satisfying clunk and pop out easily when the eject button is pressed. The drive clunks and whirs loudly when in use, which I personally enjoy because I can actually hear it working despite being hard of hearing, but it's worth taking note of because if you're trying to use this thing at night when other people are sleeping, you might wake them up. Disk access is fast, really fast compared to many other systems at the time. This thing outperforms the C64's disk drive by a long way, although in the C64's defense, this was due to Commodore's marketing department insisting on backward compatibility with the FIG-20, and sadly that had to include the major design flaw in the 6552 VIA interface that Commodore's engineers just didn't have time to work around. As a result, the CPC had a disk drive that allowed it to compete on a level playing field with dedicated business machines, something Amstrad were keen to emphasise when pushing the CPC as a real contender in both the home and the office. The FD-1 also managed to beat Commodore's offering in terms of storage space, albeit only just. The FD-1 offers 178K when formatted for AMS-DOS, while the CPM1541, Commodore's most common drive for the C64, only offers 170K. However, it should be noted that the CPC is CPM compatible, and therefore it also has the capability to create CPM formatted disks, which have a storage capacity of only 169K due to the need to include 2 tracks on the disk full of the CPM BIOS data. All in all, it's a chunky, well-built drive that will give decades of good service. Mine certainly has. So, finally, let's take a look at the disks that we could use with the CPC 464 and its fancy new disk drive. What kind of disks were they? Would they be the 5¼ inch floppies that the BBC and C64 favoured? Would they be 3.5 inch disks favoured by Apple and the emerging IBM PC? No, of course not. For all the wonderful build quality and the impressive access speed, this is still Amstrad we're talking about. Something stupid had to make it through to the finished product. They went with 3-inch disks, the kind of thing that nobody else wanted to use, the size that lost out on the disk format wars. Welcome to the Betamax of disk sizes, everyone. Amstrad stuck their CPC users with the HD DVD of disk drives. Wonderful. All joking aside, however, these chunky little disks are pretty nifty, and thanks to Amstrad buying Sinclair and subsequently welding a 3-inch drive onto the Spectrum in the Plus 3, the 3-inch drive format stuck around for a lot longer than you might expect. I was still picking up fresh packs of 3-inch discs from my local branch of Dixon's well into the 90s, so it wasn't like these things were hard to come by. They were quite pricey. I remember it used to cost me about £10 for a pack of 5 discs on the high street by around 1993, but it wasn't like I had to hunt around for them or order them by post from a specialist or anything like that. The discs themselves are solid, and I mean solid. A 5¼ inch disc was very floppy and easy to damage if you didn't handle it with care. A 3½ inch disc is pretty sturdy and won't necessarily break if you knock it about a bit, but a 3-inch disc can take a wallop, which was an advantage in my case because I was a clumsy kid who dropped them quite often. The right protect notch is easily accessible on both sides of the disc because unlike the 3.5 inch discs, these 3-inch discs are double-sided, something I appreciated when I was literally saving up my pocket money in order to buy them. And you can easily flip the right protect tab across using your pen. The tab won't accidentally flip up and down as it can on a loose 3½ inch disc, so you don't have to worry about accidentally being able to overwrite your files even on a write protected disc. The capacity of the discs is reasonable for the time at 178K per side, but it's still around half the capacity per side that a 3½ inch disc could fit, which means to get the same amount of storage space you would have to flip the disc over. It's not a massive problem, especially since the total size of one side of the disc is still larger than the memory capacity of the CPC 464 and the latest 6128, but if you're working with large files or large numbers of files, it can become a hassle. Discs can store data in one large block, which is how most games and programs were published, but there is also the option of keeping your files in user sectors. These are described in the DDI-1 manual as for specialist use only. There are 16 user local areas available, numbered 0 to 15, as per the CPM standard, and each can store a number of files. Some later GUIs, such as the PD program Worktop, could use the user areas in a similar way to how we create folders on our Windows or Mac computers today, although CPM of course uses them in its own way, and we'll cover that in a future episode when we take a proper look at CPM. Suffice to say for the moment that unless you want to work with a lot of files and need some way of keeping them apart from one another, you are very unlikely to need to worry about user spaces, and you can simply keep all of your files in the default root area. Now, there is one other thing to be aware of if you have a CPC disk drive and you find that it doesn't work, or if you're browsing retro listings to source a disk drive for your system. The drives use a rubber band for their drive belt, and these bands don't last forever. Since I picked up my disk drive second hand in 1991, I have had 3 bands in the drive, and it has failed again as I was writing this section for the show. See that disk missing message? Get used to it. You will see a lot of that when the drive belt starts to fail, and then it will be your constant companion until you replace it. Thankfully, replacement bands are fairly simple to track down, and you can replace all of them with about 10 minutes work, or less if you know what you're doing. There are detailed instructions on doing this on the CPC wiki, link in the description. Just be careful about losing the write protect pin. I'm pretty sure I've lost mine because I've been experiencing problems writing to disks recently. It's something I'll have to look into when I open the drive up. As a final remark, it's worth noting that the DDI-1 can introduce compatibility issues with some CPC 464 software. The interface increases the amount of memory that's used by the CPC at startup by 1280 bytes, or just over 1K. The memory block it uses is at the end of the space available to users, and is therefore not something that would usually be accessed by software, only becoming a problem when working on large files, such as a huge spreadsheet or a text document. However, some software loads data into the upper memory range as a matter of course, in order to keep it unaffected by the software using other blocks for its own purposes. Memory allocation by block or address range is common in some games, and also a number of business packages, and when you know what address range is accessible to users, that's perfectly fine. The CPC's manual even comes with a nice diagram explaining its memory layout so coders can allocate their memory use without worry. But now, the available blocks of memory are different, and suddenly that's a problem. Third-party manufacturers aren't the only ones to fall foul of this problem. Loading the home runner portion of the 464's welcome tape with the DDI-1 attached to the computer will cause problems, because the demo allocates memory to the address block that is now used by the DDI-1 interface. Which is hilarious in some ways, because Amstrad had already had prototypes of the disk interface at the CPC's launch. So what's going on? Either they never tested the welcome tape with the interface attached to the computer, or the memory block that the interface uses was changed after the CPC launched. Or, and this is a definite possibility, they were aware of the compatibility problem and just didn't care, because the vast majority of users would not be affected. I'll let you decide which one it is. All in all, the DDI-1 and FD-1 are well worth picking up if you have a CPC 464 and you want to work with disks. They are solid add-ons, and when I got mine in the early 90s, I fell in love with it immediately. Whether you want to use your CPC for games or more serious applications, or something in between, the speed and ease of use of discs makes them perfect. I can't recommend them enough. Of course, these days there are other alternatives such as the Gotek floppy drive emulator and oh so many products from that genius inventor Zaxxon, but we'll be taking a look at those in a later episode. For now, it's safe to say that a disk drive isn't quite an essential purchase for any CPC 464 user, but it certainly is number 1 in the list of top 10 add-ons that you'll want to have if you want to get the most out of your system. Now let's come more up to date with a look at a modern program. This episode we're taking a look at Pentomino, a puzzle game with 464 puzzles to solve. Quite fitting really. And that sounds quite a lot, so there should be some good stuff in here to keep people occupied for quite some time. Also, check out that amazing music. This plays when the loading screen appears, which was a surprise. I remember Ocean's Port Hunchback 2 plays a trill when it brought up the loading screen, but I've never seen or heard of an entire tune being used on a loading screen before. It's a wonderfully upbeat tune though, so if you're not running this on a 464 and you're loading from tape, I highly recommend you press pause and listen for a while. Press a key when you're ready to continue loading the game, and don't forget to unpause. The whole thing takes less than 5 minutes to load in, which isn't bad at all. This is a very impressive game with a lot of polish to it. The puzzles range from the very easy to the mind-bogglingly difficult, but each one is presented in a lovely, colourful manner, and its controls are very easy to get to grips with. I used the joystick, and it quickly became second nature to navigate using the cardinal controls. Grab a block with a fire button, and then rotate it by holding down the fire button and pressing either left and right to rotate the block, or up and down to flip it. Once you've arranged the blocks into the correct orientation and placed them into the grey squares to completely fill those squares without overlap, you complete the puzzle and can move on to the next one using the fire button. In the meantime, you can enjoy the brilliant in-game music. It's just as bright and cheerful as the loading screen tune was, and it fits with the aesthetic of the game perfectly. It's simple to get to grips with this game, but it's damn hard to complete all the puzzles. This is one that will keep puzzle game fans happy for quite some time, and it's one that has been a pleasure to review, and I highly recommend it. And that's all we've got time for in this episode. As we reach the end of August 1984, the Amstrad CPC 464 is well and truly established on the market. Its user base is growing steadily, and so is its library of software. So join us in the next episode as we move into September, when we'll take a look at how the CPC has progressed in its endeavours to enter the schools and educational market, and we'll also be casting an eye over the CPC 464 users' very nice programming contest with its £2,000 prize. That's all in episode 3, so I look forward to seeing you next time.